The Ghostly Hitchhiker. There's a stretch of road just outside of town that locals avoid, especially at night. They call it Dead Man's Lane. It's a two-lane highway that winds through thick woods and along a cliff's edge. There's nothing remarkable about the road during the day. The asphalt cracks in places, and the trees cast long shadows over it. But when the sun dips below the horizon and the night swallows the sky, Dead Man's Lane becomes something else, something sinister. Most people in town have heard the rumors, the stories that get passed around late at night, in dimly lit bars, or at backyard campfires. Stories of a hitchhiker, always seen alone, standing at the side of the road with their thumb out, eyes downcast. They're always described the same. A young woman, mid-20s, long dark hair, dressed in a faded white dress that looks too thin for the weather. But the most unsettling part? She never speaks a word. People who have seen her say she's silent as a grave, her lips never parting, her eyes never meeting theirs. The unlucky few who pick her up, they never seem the same afterward. Some go missing entirely, others return with stories too wild to believe. Those who live to tell the tale, well, they wish they hadn't. It was a chilly autumn evening when Jake found himself driving down Dead Man's Lane. He wasn't a local. He was just passing through on his way to a nearby city for work. He'd been on the road for hours, the back roads snaking through unfamiliar territory. His GPS had lost signal about 30 miles back, but he wasn't worried. He had a vague sense of where he was headed, and Dead Man's Lane seemed like the most direct route to his destination. The headlights of his old pickup truck carved through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. Every now and then, the wind rustled through the trees, sending dry leaves scattering across the pavement. Jake leaned back in his seat, one hand on the wheel, the other adjusting the radio. Static filled the cab. No station seemed to come through clearly this far out. He gave up on the radio and settled into the quiet hum of the engine. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. A figure standing at the side of the road. His foot instinctively eased off the gas as his truck rolled closer. In the glow of his headlights, he could make out the woman. Long dark hair, thin white dress, pale skin. She was standing still, facing the trees, her back to him. Jake frowned and checked his rearview mirror. What was a woman doing out here all alone, this late? He slowed the truck to a crawl, and as he approached, he saw her raise her hand, thumb pointing toward the sky. A hitchhiker. He glanced around. No other cars. No houses. Nothing but the dense woods and the endless road stretching ahead. Against his better judgment, Jake pulled over, rolling down his window as he came to a stop beside her. "Hey," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "You need a ride?" She didn't respond, didn't turn to face him, just kept her thumb out, head bowed slightly as if waiting. Jake hesitated. Something about this didn't feel right. But leaving her alone out here, on a road like this, he couldn't do it. He reached over, unlocking the passenger door. "Hop in." Slowly, the woman lowered her hand and turned toward the truck. Her movements were smooth, almost mechanical, as if she wasn't entirely human. Jake's breath hitched as she stepped into the headlights fully. Her dress was old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in movies from decades past. It was dirt-stained, and her bare feet shuffled across the gravel without a sound. Without a word, she opened the passenger door and slid into the seat. The truck dipped slightly under her weight. Jake shifted uncomfortably as she settled in, staring straight ahead, her face pale and expressionless. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual as he shifted the truck into gear. No response. She didn't even look at him. Her hands rested in her lap, her head tilted forward just slightly, as if she were deep in thought. Jake cleared his throat, nerves creeping up his spine. He wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but something about this woman wasn't right. He could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. He glanced at her again, this time noticing the way her skin seemed unnaturally pale, almost translucent in the dim light of the dashboard. The silence stretched on as he drove, the road narrowing and winding as it curved through the woods. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. Jake kept his eyes on the road, but every few seconds, he'd steal a glance at his passenger. Still staring straight ahead, still silent. The minutes dragged by, and Jake's unease grew. He cleared his throat again, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You, got a name?" Again, nothing. She didn't even blink. Jake's pulse quickened. His foot pressed down harder on the gas, eager to get off this stretch of road and drop the woman off at the nearest town, wherever that might be. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe she was in shock. Maybe something bad had happened to her, and she couldn't talk. That had to be it, right? But then, out of nowhere, she spoke. Her voice was a whisper, so faint Jake almost didn't hear it. "Turn here." Jake blinked, glancing at her. Her head had turned slightly, her eyes still trained on the road ahead, but now she was pointing. Sure enough, there was a dirt road branching off from Dead Man's Lane, barely visible in the dim light. "What? You want me to turn here?" She didn't respond, just kept pointing. Jake's gut screamed at him to ignore her, to keep driving, but something about her tone, her presence, made it impossible to resist. Reluctantly, he turned the wheel, guiding the truck onto the narrow dirt path. The tires crunched over the loose gravel, and the trees closed in around them, the road barely wide enough for the vehicle. The deeper they went, the darker it got. The headlights barely cut through the thickening mist that seemed to rise from the ground. The air grew colder, more oppressive, and Jake could feel the weight of something watching them from the trees. Suddenly, the woman turned her head, her eyes locking onto Jake for the first time. Her gaze was piercing, dark, and empty, like staring into an abyss. "This is where they took me," she whispered. Jake's blood ran cold. "What? What do you mean?" he stammered, his heart pounding. She didn't answer. Instead, her form began to shift, her features melting into something unnatural, something inhuman. Her skin turned ashen, her eyes hollow and black, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Jake slammed on the brakes, his hands shaking on the wheel. The woman's body contorted, her bones cracking as she leaned closer to him, her face inches from his. "They never let me leave." With a sudden, blood-curdling scream, she lunged at him. The last thing Jake saw was her cold, lifeless eyes staring into his soul. The next morning, the police found Jake's truck abandoned on the dirt road, the doors wide open. Of him, there was no sign, and the woman? She had never been there to begin with. And so, the legend of the ghostly hitchhiker grew. Another lost soul claimed by Dead Man's Lane.